there is something in us that knows how to respond to each other's pain. There is something natural in us. And I think that might be called our humanity. And then there are things that happen over the course of our lifetimes throughout our culture that damage and diminish that make us people for whom that response seems less and less quick, where there are people for whom we can't access it easily and others for whom we maybe can't access it at all. And so our media and our culture and all of these messages continually reinforce this idea that in order to be deserving of care, victims have to be innocent in some way. Sometimes that's that narrow, sort of nebulous notion of purity, right? Some idea of being good that usually calls up an image of someone more like me than like others, and like me when I'm behaving in certain ways. Sometimes it's a matter for the courts, right? It's a comparison to legal guilt. Sometimes it shows up in our statute and the questions about who can and can't access victims' compensation as they move through the trauma and pain and injuries of violent crime. And in spirit and practice, intentionally and unintentionally, it is devastating for victims of crime.
Thank you guys for being here. So as she said, my name is Kate Adamo, and I am the National Policy Advocate at the Sex Workers Project. We are a legal and social services counseling organization that works with folks in the sex trade across the spectrum of choice, circumstance, or coercion. So we have a fairly robust anti-trafficking project. We all have a narrative attached to our heads, and that narrative always has, someone who's committing a crime and then a victim of a crime. And it's the story that we tell each other. It's the story that CSI told us last night, or whenever it's on. I actually don't watch that show. But we get it from a lot of different places. And it's always this tale. It's this cultural myth that's developed. And so, we can talk about the story of trafficking in the law. And we can talk about the story of how it plays out. But I think one of the things that's really quickly forgotten is that when we have a crime that we're talking about, when we have this experience, there's the story in our heads, there's the law in our heads, and there's the law in the heads of everyone who interacts with that story, of the person who's experiencing it, of the person who is perpetrating what we consider a crime, of the law enforcement officer that interacts with that person, of the direct services person. And that story is incredibly important. It's very influenced by the conversations that we have about innocence, about what creates a victim. And so the way that people are marginalized through criminalization happens in myriad different ways. And what happens when you criminalize a population is that you turn them into a target population. And so when folks trade sex and when folks engage in different types of criminal activity, what you're saying is you are viewed by society, and you're probably viewing yourself first as a criminal. And so your ability to seek justice for an experience of victimization becomes that much harder. Because when you walk in and you say, I've been victimized by a client and I was trading sex while it happened, you're admitting to a crime that's really easy to prosecute, and you're asking them to work on a crime that's extremely difficult to find out. And so when you experience that, when you hold that identity to yourself, when you know that you're engaging in criminal activity, it makes it very difficult to figure out what justice looks like for you. When we talk about innocence, and when we remove innocence from someone and say you're no longer an innocent victim because you have a record, because you're formerly incarcerated, because you're engaging in criminal activity, and therefore I don't see you as the victim that I'm looking for, that becomes a very difficult experience. You get to work with someone outside this framework. You get to work with someone outside of the singular idea that they have a need and that I can provide that need. And so you get to work with people not necessarily as victims, but as full-fledged people with very robust lives who have experienced victimization.
How you guys doing? My name is Kenton Kirby. I'm the Director of Trauma Support Services at the Crown Heights Community Mediation Center. One of the things, I run a program called Make It Happen, and Make It Happen is a project that's for young men of color between the ages of 16 and 24 who've been directly and indirectly impacted by community violence. And why do I say directly and indirectly? We look at victims as people that are actually acting out, and victims are ones that are actually receiving, that are traditional victims. A lot of times the young men that we work with have some serious immediate needs that need to be met. So you're not going to sit and tell me about your pain when you don't know where you're going to get your next meal. You don't know where you're sleeping that night. You don't feel safe in your neighborhood going down this block to come to my group, or come to meet with me individually. When I think of innocence, I look at innocence as everyone has a reaction When things happen to you, it hurts you. It sits with you, it follows with you. It may look different from a 6'4" black man with tattoos and compared to a 22-year-old white woman from the suburbs, but at the end of the day, it's still a response, it's still pain, it still needs healing.
I broke my my teeth in terms of accountability with victim services, which later became Safe Horizon. And, working with perpetrators and abusers of domestic violence, it's like, gosh, checking my own stuff as a man, checking my own stuff in terms of, my own sexism, but also understanding that I am a man of color, and while I may not have been sexually abused and I didn't have domestic violence that were of any significance in my family that, warped and carried me into some that dark place, it's important for me to do this work, but to also let people know I'm not holding on to any of this. My ego is not attached to the work that I do, because there's enough work to go around. So whether you're working with trafficking men and women, boys and girls, whether you're working with the most disparaged people, search out the other models. I'm going to throw out just a couple of things. Wrong Place, Wrong Time by Dr. John Rich, okay? The whole self model, which is safety, emotions, loss, and future. Check those models out, because most of the people that are really going to be talking about some of the things that you really have questions to and you really need those answers, they're not going to be the ones that's kind of coming to these podiums.
I'm Katchagru Dos Santos, and I am the Director of Client Services at the New York City Anti-Violence Project. The AVP envisions a world in which LGBTQ and HIV-affected people live free of violence. We know that innocence is a particularly thorny and difficult concept. Our history, right, is that until just until the 70s, being homosexual, which is what it was called then, being gay was in fact a psychiatric disorder. We know that in many places, including New York State, you can currently be transgender and lose your job, and that's perfectly legal. We know that we are slow to provide economic opportunities for people who differ from the heteronormative concept, the binary gender idea of what is normal. And so many LGBTQ communities, particularly marginalized LGBTQ communities, so LGBTQ folks who are also struggling with poverty, who are also people of color, who are also immigrants, have intersecting identities that are marginalized, that layer oppression, and increase our risk for violence, and increase our risk for poverty and homelessness, and incarceration and criminalization. LGBTQ identities have been criminalized for a long time, and that still happens now. So we hear from our clients, from gay men who are walking through Central Park and are profiled as engaging in sex work because they were in the wrong part of Central Park, and are arrested for that, and now have a criminal record. And if they happen to be robbed or experience sexual violence or physical violence while they were going through Central Park in the wrong area, they're not an innocent victim, right? Because they were in the wrong place. And that it is therefore assumed that they were engaging in something that wasn't legal. Their victim status is sort of revoked because they were doing something they shouldn't be doing according to some standards. We see this in particular for trans people and gender nonconforming people, and particularly trans women of color. I'm sure many of you have seen Laverne Cox and Janet Mock talk about the state of emergency for trans women of color in this country. By the time we started the blog, Chanel and I, there were 16 trans women, trans and gender nonconforming people, 15 of whom were people of color who had been murdered in the United States. And by the time the blog got published, there were 19, and that number is rising. That's just this year in 2015. So when people can't walk down the street and be who they are, and they are profiled as sex workers, they're profiled as dangerous to society, which bathroom they use is policed, and if they defend themselves against violence, they're the ones who are arrested. We're seeing a lot of situations in which people who we clearly feel are survivors of violence and crime, who don't meet that innocent victim standard because, as Kate mentioned, they experienced sexual violence while they were engaged in sex work. Or they were robbed and they had been accused of, they were profiled as engaging in sex work or other illegal activity. We know that trans folks, particularly trans folks of color, have 4 times the national rates of poverty. They are 4 to 6 times as likely to experience violence from the police. They have higher degrees of police engagement. But they are barred from accessing police as safety. They are often experience extreme barriers to accessing victim services organizations, social service organizations, because they don't meet the criteria. So this is a community which is marginalized in multiple ways, experiences great economic deprivation and barriers to accessing economic opportunity, is forced into informal economies, many of which are criminalized, and therefore from a number, and doesn't feel often there's a lack of trust with law enforcement and other resources. And due to that, they're not able to actually get to the point where they have the proof or the credibility to be seen as victims and be eligible for services or supports. So it's really important, I think, that we understand that that our narrow definition of what a victim is and this sort of very complex idea or overly simplified idea of what innocence is really hurts the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, the most hurt in our society, and we've got to change that around.
So my name is Maureen Curtis. I oversee the criminal justice programs at Safe Horizon. What it means, or what we think of as a society when we think of a victim of domestic violence and what sometimes is termed as a good victim. If you ask somebody what they think, who is a victim of domestic violence, you often hear somebody who's battered, somebody who's bruised, somebody who is seeking services to end the relationship. And if they're not that person, then we consider them not a good victim. Think about hearing, and I'm sure we've all heard it, she or he provoked the violence. What did they do to provoke him or her hitting her? And we know in the field that you can provoke feelings, but if you choose to be violent, that's a choice. But in asking that question, and it's asked often, we are now taking away innocence from that victim and putting blame on that victim. To me, the most telling example of this is when there's a domestic violence homicide. When there's a domestic violence homicide and you read an article in the paper, sadly, you often read in the article what the victim did, what they didn't do. Did they get an order of protection? Did they not get an order of protection? Did they leave the person who's abusing them? Did they stay with the person who's abusing them? They're dead, and we're still asking them, and we're still judging them for what they're doing. Hence, we're taking away their innocence. Victims are not all compliant. They're not all battered and bruised. It doesn't mean that they're not a victim and deserving of services.
I would start with the language. Innocence and victim kind of doesn't make sense to me. Victim is a victim. The responses to experiencing a traumatic incident, a traumatic event, is the same for someone who is labeled innocent and someone who's labeled a criminal or a bad person. It's very important that we really look at victim as a victim.
Harm party, responsible party is coming to my language.
We work with, if you look at our stats, over 250,000 crime victims, and yet so few of them are young men of color. And And what does that say? You know, I mean, why are we not, when we know that many of the victims of crime in New York City are young men of color? So that challenge, you know, we decided to take on, and we just found out that we have gotten a grant where some of my esteemed colleagues in the audience here, in their programs, are going to be starting doing work with young men of color, and it's going to be something that we will be doing as an agency. And we're really excited about that.
I feel like we have to move forward with survivor, not just survivor-informed, but in many ways, I think survivor-led programming. And I think that's really essential. I think we want much less of, like, you know, super educated white women like me up here. Speaking only for myself, not the fellow super educated white women I'm with. But I think it's really important to recognize that we have to really work with the folks who are most impacted and find out what they need, what would be different in a good way for them, and not assume we know, and not use old paradigms and old learning, you know, to figure out what's best.
This person was exploited and forced into the sex trade or into domestic work by another person. We're missing the fact that, you know, before that they were homeless, and before that they went to every shelter service, but, you know, we have enough shelter services for youth that cover like 5% of the need every single night in New York City, and so they couldn't get a bed there. And we missed the fact that before that they were in foster care, because before that they were in an environment where, you know, their parent or their step-parent or their caregiver was transphobic and refused to let them live as they wanted to. And before that they were victimized by, you know, different institutional settings, be it hospitals or be it schools or be it law enforcement, and we're victimized by, you know, pervasive homophobia and transphobia and racism and you know, class narratives along the way. And so when we see a moment of trauma and we say, all right, there was a perpetrator and they hurt you, and we stop at the end, we miss the fact that they were living a life before that that wasn't that made that experience, that made them vulnerable to that experience, and we let everything else off the hook. And we forget that for so many people, trauma often starts at a place far before we recognize it, if we're only using criminal justice to assess what's going on in a person's life.